and Mike. Thank you. How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Orson Welles. I'm speaking for the Mercury Theater, and what follows is supposed to advertise our first motion picture. Citizen Kane is the title, and we hope it can correctly be called a coming attraction. It's certainly coming to this theater, and I think our Mercury actors make it an attraction. I'd like you to meet them. Speaking of attractions, well, the chorus girls are certainly an attraction, but frankly, ladies and gentlemen, we're just showing you the chorus girls for purposes of ballyhoo. It's pretty nice ballyhoo. But here's some of our real Mercury people. This is the first time you've seen most of them on the screen. Hey, give Joe a little light. Thanks. Now smile for the folks, Joe. Joseph Cotton, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. Joseph Cotton. I think you're going to see a lot of him. Here's Ruth Warwick, whom I know you love. Ruth. Look at the camera, Ruth. We caught Ruth with her hair up. And here's somebody you've all heard on the radio, so I don't have to tell you he's wonderful. Ray Collins. Dorothy Commongore is a name I'm going to repeat. Dorothy Commongore. I won't have to repeat it much longer. You'll be repeating it. And here's George Coulouris, who's a grand actor. I'll say that name again. George Coulouris. Watch it. Here comes Everett Sloane. Look out, Everett. Oops. Everett Sloane, ladies and gentlemen, he isn't necessarily a comedian. And here's one of the best in the world, Agnes Moorehead. I've said a lot of nice things, but Erskine Sanford deserves some more. Erskine Sanford. So does Paul. Paul Stewart, everybody. Citizen Kane is a modern American story about a man called Kane, Charles Foster Kane. I don't know how to tell you about him. There's so many things to say. I'll turn you over instead to the characters in the picture. As you'll see, they feel very strongly on the subject.
Charles Foster Kane is...
Sure, he started the war. But do you think if it hadn't been for Mr. Kane, the United States would have the Panama Canal?
Charles Foster Kane is nothing more or less
and a communist.
Kane, governor. Listen, when the voters of this state and Mrs. Kane learn what I found out about Mr. Kane and a certain little blondie named Susan Alexander, he couldn't be elected dog catcher. I'm going to skin Mr. Charles Foster Kane alive.
I'm going to marry him next week at the White House.
Emily, I hear you've been stepping out with Charlie Kane.
Of course I love him. I gave him $60 million.
Well, of course I love him. He's the richest man in America.
I can't help but admire him.
He's crazy.
He's wonderful.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what you'll think about Mr. Kane. I can't imagine. You see, I play the part myself. Well, Kane is a hero and a scoundrel, a no-account and a swell guy, a great lover, a great American citizen, and a dirty dog. It depends on who's talking about him. What's the real truth about Charles Foster Kane? I wish you'd come to this theater when Citizen Kane plays here and decide for yourself.
Hello everybody, welcome to Film Gold, and this is episode 32. This is part one of a deep dive into Citizen Kane. It's been a long time since the last episode, about 6 months I think, but hopefully this is a worthy follow-up to our Orson Welles deep dive, which we recorded last summer and which went out in July, August and September, I believe. And I did that with David Ghosty Wills, who is quite an Orson Welles aficionado. I would, of course, recommend listening to that before this, but it's not essential. And in fact, I'm going to be including a little bit from those shows to get you warmed up for this film. Just in case you're new to the podcast, welcome. My name is Antony Rotuno. I have my own little podcast network of 3 shows. So this one, Film Gold, Glass Onion on John Lennon, about John Lennon and sometimes General Beatles, and Life and Life Only, which focuses on psychology and alternative media. What you just heard there was the very creative trailer for Citizen Kane. I'll put the video version in the show notes and I highly recommend you watch that. So, Citizen Kane is a 1941 American drama film You might call it a mock biography, perhaps, based on a couple or more of real-life people. It was directed by, produced by, and starring Orson Welles, and was co-written by Welles and Herman J. Mankiewicz. And this was Welles' first feature film. I spent about 2 weeks in the world of this film. I've always liked it. I'll talk a little bit about my history with it later on. And I did draw quite a lot from the enormous Wikipedia page on this film. I used a few other sources, documentaries, dipped into a couple of books. And in the end, I amassed more than 30 pages. And I wouldn't really call them notes. It's almost more like scripts. So this should be fairly smooth in terms of the recording. I will interject if the mood takes me, but don't feel I have to interject too much when reading the amount of notes I've got here. What I've decided to do, I'm going to break this into fairly small parts, manageable parts. There's going to be 2 parts on the making of the film, and then probably 2 parts when we get to the actual scenes of the film as well. It's going to be a bit of a journey here. Now, regarding Welles, bear in mind, if you did listen to our deep dive on him, Ghosty's line that before Welles had even embarked on his film career, he'd already amassed a body of work on radio and in the theatre that would be enough for most people. You know, if he'd disappeared at the age of 25, they would still be talking about Orson Welles as some kind of legend, maybe a radio and theatre legend. We covered all that in the deep dive in part 1 of that, so I won't go through it all now. Citizen Kane's premiere was at the Palace Theatre in New York, and that was 5 days before Welles' 26th birthday. He had arrived in Hollywood a couple of months after his 24th birthday, so he'd already amassed all this work that we talked about before he was 24. He'd had almost, I wouldn't say a full career, because he had plenty more to do in radio and theatre, as well as having a film career, but, you know, he'd amassed a serious body of work by the age that John Lennon was when he became a world superstar. Now, it's always hard to know where to start with something as mammoth as this film. This film is really like the granddaddy of American films, and I'm not going to argue here about whether it's the greatest film ever made. Ghosty and I talked about that tag and how it was a bit of a millstone. What I would really like you to do as you're listening to this, and we're going to be going scene by scene through the film later on, is to try and maybe wipe the slate clean, forget about all the greatest film tag, and just take this on its merits. I want to say off the bat that this is a fairly deep dive into Citizen Kane, but it's not an exhaustive review, because that would be impossible to do, certainly in podcast form. It's certainly been exhausting to prepare it, but hopefully not for you to listen to it. But I had to stop at some point, because I could have gone on researching this. There's a million other books that have probably got more tidbits of information that I didn't pick up from the research that I did do. But I watched the film a few times. I watched it once more as a refresher, and then twice more with commentaries. And then, obviously, the documentaries I watched on it had scenes from the film as well. So I feel like I know this pretty well by now. And when I'm watching the film, I feel like I understand as much as you can what it's trying to do and what was in Welles' mind, and Herman J. Mankiewicz. I'm going to refer to him as Mank from now on, because there was a film made about him with that title. What they had in mind and who it was about. We will get into that, but I don't want to put myself under more pressure to say I'm going to be covering every story to do with Citizen Kane, because there's a couple that I'm not going to be covering in particular. I'd probably say that these episodes, the series I'm doing, would benefit from you having watched the film at least once. I mean, that almost goes without saying. I can't imagine why someone would want to listen for 4 or 5 hours, however long this is going to be, without watching the film. But I would probably say it's worth even a rewatch, especially if it's been a while since you've seen it, because I'm going to not exactly assume prior knowledge, but I'm not going to be spoon-feeding the film to you. So it would be a good idea if you did know a little bit about it. Someone I was listening to talking about this film was saying that they recommend, if you've never seen the film, watch it once for the story and then watch it again for the lighting, the sound, the music, all the other technical marvels that they are in this film. Now, you can get some prior knowledge from the 20 minutes or so that Ghosty and I spent talking about this. That's episode 30, part 2 of the deep dive into Orson. And after I've talked about the trailer, I'm going to give you a bit of a refresher, in fact. This trailer was nearly 4 minutes, quite long, and the usual method was for a studio film editor to compile a montage of highlights for a coming attractions kind of trailer, which would be shown to audiences shortly before the film came to their local cinema. So it would have scenes from the film and you'd get a good taste of it. The trailer for Citizen Kane, like the film itself really, is radically different from the way things were normally done. I mean, I suppose it was a pioneer of what's now known as a teaser trailer. So you pique the viewer's curiosity, but you don't actually reveal any of the content of the film. I'm reading quite a bit of this from Wikipedia, by the way. The Citizen Kane trailer does not feature a single second of footage of the actual film itself, but acts as a wholly original, tongue-in-cheek, pseudo-documentary piece on the film's production. Filmed at the same time as Citizen Kane itself, the trailer follows an unseen Welles, and I've got a note here with his marvellous voice that got spikier as he got older, but his tones are very dulcet at this time. He provides narration for a tour around the film set, introductions to the film's core cast members from his Mercury Theatre, and notice that he's introducing the actors rather than the characters. I'll talk a bit more about the supporting cast. There's a nice little trick with Everett Sloane, who plays Bernstein in the film, appearing at first to be running into a camera, but it turns out to be the reflection of the camera. And if you look back at it now, the trailer is actually quite clever because it's employing the modus operandi of Citizen Kane itself, which is to use little tricks and to use creativity. The other thing you have in this trailer is a brief overview of the Kane character by use of the other characters talking about him. Welles himself talks about Kane. At the time, it was almost unprecedented for a film trailer to not actually feature anything of the film itself. Okay, now I'm going to do something that I've never done, perhaps inspired by Citizen Kane to be a bit unorthodox. I'm going to play you the first 6 minutes of episode 30, which includes a few filmmakers and cinephiles talking about the film, and some clips from the Arena documentary on Welles. If you're interested in Orson Welles, that one is an absolute must-see. If you've already heard episode 30, or you've heard it just before you listened to this or recently, and you do want to skip forward, you just need to skip forward exactly 6 minutes and 50 seconds. And for the rest of you, here we go.
Citizen Kane is the most important, greatest American film as far as I'm concerned.
This is the gold standard here.
It's pretty hard to top Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane is the greatest movie ever made.
Is that really your idea of how to run a newspaper?
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher. I just try everything I can think of.
There's never been a film that I'm aware of that if you watch it for the 138th time, you can still see something new that you hadn't noticed before.
I made no campaign promises because until a few weeks ago, I had no hope of being elected. Now, however, I have something more than a hope. And Jim Geddes has something less than a chance.
Every single, not just every scene, but every shot has an idea. There's a concept and an idea being executed at every second of that film.
There's this extraordinary performance which people seem to take for granted. I mean, Orson ages from 25 to 85 in this movie, and he's totally believable in every phase of it.
Rosebud.
Orson Welles was brilliant. I mean, and that was like his first film, and he was 26 years old.
It is just one of the great movies ever made, and I think many people are going to agree. It's just one of the great American experiences.
Throw that junk.
Citizen Kane will always be something that demands attention and respect and admiration for another way of looking at the world through the cinematic eye.
The story told through this dense and complicated array of techniques is an investigation into a man's life. Kane is seen not simply at different stages of his life, a bravura piece of acting by the 25-year-old Wells, but also through the eyes and the testimony of different witnesses.
In fact, which came first? Was it the story of Citizen Kane, or was it the idea of looking at a life?
That was what came first. But my co-author, Mankiewicz, took off with me on the idea of making it based on some big American figure. And we thought of a president. That was because Hughes had got us starting thinking that way. I wasn't going to have played Hughes because I wouldn't have been good in it. It was going to be Cotton who would have played Hughes. And we said, well, let's get a part I can play. And before we decided what sort of big man it would be, we began on this idea of seeing it from various points of view. And the original scripts, or at least storylines, had much more dramatic differences of point of view. It was much more of a trick. It was much more Rashomon than it ended up being. For instance, a man who hated him, you would then see a scene in which Kane was totally hateful. Somebody who loved him, you would see him totally lovable. And that isn't so in the movie, you know. We see what he is all the time, I think, or at least we tried to do it.
Charles, you know perfectly well there's not the slightest proof that this armada's off the Jersey
Hello,
coast.
Mr. Bernstein.
Excuse me, Mr.
Can you
Kane.
prove it isn't?
This just
Mr.
came
Bernstein,
in.
I'd like you to meet Mr. Thatcher.
I'll just borrow How do you do, Mr. Thatcher?
Leland,
Hello.
Mr. Thatcher, my ex-guardian. We have no secrets from our readers, Mr. Bernstein. Mr. Thatcher is one of our most devoted readers. He knows what's wrong with every copy of the Enquirer since I took over. Read the cable.
Girls delightful in Cuba, stop. Could send you prose poems about scenery, but don't feel right spending your money. Stop. There is no war in Cuba. Signed, Wheeler. Any answer?
Yes, dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems. I'll provide the war.
You said once that Kane seemed to you to have been really quite close to parody as a character. You said once he was rather close to burlesque. I didn't know if you meant the way you played him or the way he was conceived.
I don't know what I meant by that. Maybe that comes from one of those foreign language interviews where I pretend I understand the question and say, yes, you know. There's a whole lot of things I'm supposed to have said that really come from me not hearing very well or not being as good a linguist as I pretend to be.
What most people thought Wells had in mind was a real-life newspaper tycoon, the biggest of them all, William Randolph Hearst, the Baron of the Yellow Press and one of the most powerful men in America. Look first at the description of Citizen Kane's fictional palace, Xanadu, from the March of Time sequence.
Here on the deserts of the Gulf Coast, a private mountain was commissioned and successfully built. 100,000 trees, 20,000 tons of marble are the ingredients of Xanadu's mountain. Contents of Xanadu's palace. Paintings, pictures, statues, the very stones of many another palace. A collection of everything. So big it can never be catalogued or appraised. Enough for 10 museums, the loot of the world. Xanadu's livestock, the fowl of the air, the fish of the sea, the beast of the field and jungle. 2 of each, the biggest private zoo since Noah.
What are you doing? Oh, one thing I never can understand, Susan. How do you know you haven't done it before?
Makes a whole lot more sense than collecting statues.
You may be right.
I love the line at the beginning of that where he says every scene has an idea. As you know, I mean, I'm a big ideas guy, and I love people with ideas, even if they don't always come off. It was mentioned there of Rashomon as well. If you're not aware of that film, it's a Kurosawa film from 1950 which shows the same event, which is a samurai being killed in a forest from different perspectives. And now we have the phrase the Rashomon effect, where lots of people see the same event and have a very different interpretation. So I'm going to give you some background to the film now. As I mentioned, the Wikipedia page is enormous, and I've used that and some other bits and pieces. I took notes while I was viewing the film as well, and had quite a few observations. Now, I'd recommend a couple of documentaries. The Battle Over Citizen Kane. This is a documentary about the making of the film, but it's really a study of two giant-sized Americans. And I mean that in more than one aspect. Obviously, Orson was giant-sized towards the end of his life, but in terms of personality, so that's Orson Welles and William Randolph Hearst, both of whom had quite a taste for sensation and were probably quite similar. Now, just in case you don't know, William Randolph Hearst was a newspaper tycoon and is reckoned by some to be maybe even the sole inspiration for Charles Foster Kane. I don't agree with that, because I think Orson Welles was a lot of the inspiration for Charles Foster Kane. And perhaps Kane influenced Welles as well. We'll get to that. But that's a good documentary. It's interesting to compare these two men, and you know, they met once that we know of. I don't know if they met more than that. There was one connection they had, which I'll get to as well. But two guys probably with very, very big egos. Their egos were probably giant-sized as well. Another documentary I recommend, Citizen Kane, Anatomy of a Classic, which is presented by Barry Norman. And those of a certain age in England will, of course, know Barry from the film programmes. He was the guy when it came to films in England in terms of criticism, and he had a very reassuring voice, and that's a great documentary. In terms of the film, I've probably had seen it 5 or 6 times, and like I say, I've watched it through 3 more times, so that's a fair few. As I said, I feel like I know the film very well now, and I can guide you through it if you feel like being guided. When we get to the film and we go through the scenes, as I said, we'll go scene by scene later on with the film, and you'll really see what an interesting structure the film has. And I'll point out a few things that will flesh the film out for you. Now, just bear in mind that when Pulp Fiction came out in 1994, with its non-linear storyline, that was considered quite radical, and that was more than 50 years after this. Since there's going to be a lot here before we get to the film, some of the content will have already been mentioned, so I'm not going to repeat it all, but I've saved some of it for when the relevant scene comes up in the film, and I'll fill in all the gaps, so there'll be plenty left, don't worry. Remember that this film was made in 1941, and we would be kidding ourselves if we thought that you could take the average millennial, give them this film to watch, and try to convince them that it's better than Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or Harry Potter. This is not going to be a film for everyone. But if you just take it at its merits, consider the time it was made, then I really think you will appreciate it. Now, the famous thing, which again we did cover, was this amazing deal that Orson Welles got with RKO to make this film. It wasn't going to be Citizen Kane originally. Casual fans will know about the famous War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938. Welles apparently then turned down various offers from Warner Brothers, and one of his biographers, Frank Brady, said, although the possibility of making huge amounts of money in Hollywood greatly attracted him, he was still totally, hopelessly, insanely in love with the theatre, and it's there that he had every intention of remaining to make his mark. I'd say he'd already made his mark, but I guess he wanted to make a deeper mark on the theatre. Following the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast of his CBS radio series The Mercury Theatre on the Air, Welles was lured to Hollywood with a remarkable contract. RKO Pictures studio head George J. Schaefer wanted to work with Welles after the notorious broadcast, believing that Welles had a gift for attracting mass attention. RKO was also uncharacteristically profitable and was entering into a series of independent production contracts that would add more artistically prestigious films to its roster. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1939, Schaefer constantly tried to lure the reluctant Welles to Hollywood. Welles was in financial trouble after failure of his plays Five Kings and The Green Goddess. At first he simply wanted to spend 3 months in Hollywood and earn enough money to pay his debts and fund his next theatrical season. Welles first arrived on July the 20th, 1939, and on his first tour he called the movie studio the greatest electric train set a boy ever had. Wells signed his contract with RKO on August 21st, which stipulated that he would act in, direct, produce and write 2 films. Now, I'm going to say off the bat that a newcomer to Hollywood merely starring in a film would involve pressure. Starring in it and directing would be more pressure. Writing it as well, more pressure, and producing it. And although the writing should be traditionally done before the film is shot, there are very often rewrites being done as the film is being made. The most controversial aspect of the contract was granting Wells complete artistic control of the 2 films so long as RKO approved both project stories and the budget did not exceed $500,000. That is, of course, chicken feed now, but a pretty decent amount of money then. RKO executives would not be allowed to see any footage until Wells chose to show it to them, and no cuts could be made to either film without Wells's approval. Wells was allowed to develop the story without interference, select his own cast and crew, and have the right of final cut. Granting the final cut privilege was unprecedented for a studio because it placed artistic considerations over financial investment. And always remember, folks, it's called the film business. And you've got also the music business. It's constantly art versus commerce. It's the eternal struggle of any entertainment industry. The things really to be said about this was incredible. Final cut is sacred to a creative person, to an artist, so to speak. You can give someone $10 million to make a film and say, you can do whatever you want, but we're going to edit it. I will talk later on, this will be way in the future, about the film that Orson Welles made directly after Citizen Kane and what happened with that. In fact, we already covered it in the deep dive we did. But this is a big thing. Keep in mind as well, as the story goes on, that a lot of people are going to be very unhappy with this. This impudent young fellow comes to Hollywood, 24 years old, gets final cut. Just even without knowing him, some people are going to be jealous of that and are going to not like him. So you could almost say he's got a bit of a target on his back as soon as he gets to Hollywood. Before Kane, Wells spent the first 5 months of his RKO contract trying to get his first project going without success. It was agreed that Wells would film Heart of Darkness, previously adapted for the Mercury Theatre on the air, which would be presented entirely through a first-person camera. We did note, Ghosty and I, that we've noted similarities between Orson Welles and Marlon Brando. And Marlon Brando, of course, was in Apocalypse Now in the 70s and played Colonel Kurtz. So there's a bit of a connection there.
Good evening. This is Orson Welles, inviting you to listen now to The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Some 50 miles beyond, I came upon a hut of reeds. And here we found a piece of board with faded pencil writing on it. Hurry up, approach cautiously.
Now what the devil does that mean?
We found out later who wrote it. A company man, De Tirpitz. We came too late to do him any good. His head was grinning at us on a pole, where it had been placed in some ritual by Kurtz. I'm not disclosing any trade secrets, but I want you to understand now that Mr. Kurtz had taken a high seat amongst the devils of the land. I mean literally. Let's say his nerves went wrong. He presided at certain midnight dances ending with unspeakable rites, which I gathered were offered up to him, to Mr. Kurtz himself. You can't understand. How could you? A solid pavement under your feet, surrounded by kind neighbors ready to cheer you or to fall on you, stepping delicately between the butcher and the policeman, in the holy terror of scandal and the gallows and the lunatic asylum. How can you imagine what particular region of the first ages a man's untrammeled feet may take him by way of solitude, utter solitude, and silence? At the inner station, we found him. A group of natives appeared, wading waist-deep in the grass, bearing a stretcher. Some carried his arms, 2 shotguns, a heavy rifle, a light revolver, the thunderbolts of that pitiful Jupiter.
The dark warm of the wilderness breathed out an immense horde of naked men. A serpent that writhed and stamped. A moving chain of black bodies, carrying on their shoulders the gleaming white ivory.
Hi-yo!
Stretcher was carried up the gangplank from the deck. I looked down on the long, gaunt figure of Kurtz. Kurtz himself. The hollow cage of his ribs. A bald skeleton head, like an ivory ball. You came a long way for me. A long, hard way. It was a good hunt. You caught me alive.
I'll put in the show notes the radio version of Heart of Darkness. After elaborate pre-production and a day of test shooting with a handheld camera, unheard of at the time, the project never reached production because Welles was unable to trim $50,000 from its budget. Schaefer told Welles that the $500,000 budget could not be exceeded. As war loomed, revenue was declining sharply in Europe by the fall of 1939. Yeah, keep in mind as well, this is all happening before America got into the war. This is before Pearl Harbor, but the war is happening, World War II. So in terms of the writing, Welles conceived the project, originally called American, with screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz, a.k.a. Mank, who was writing radio plays for Welles's CBS radio series, The Campbell Playhouse. Mank based the original outline on the life of William Randolph Hearst, whom he knew socially and came to hate after being exiled from Hearst's circle. This may not mean much to people in Britain, for example, but Hearst's estate, San Simeon, was half the size of Rhode Island. So half the size of one of the American states. Even if it's one of the smaller ones, that's still pretty sizable. In February 1940, Welles supplied Mankiewicz with 300 pages of notes and put him under contract to write the first draft screenplay under the supervision, some might say babysitting, of John Houseman, Welles's former partner in the Mercury Theatre. Mankiewicz was an alcoholic and a gambler and needed supervision. The alcohol problem that he had curtailed his writing career quite badly, and I think he only had 2 screenplays under his belt in the 5 years before Citizen Kane. Quite a lot before that, though. Welles later explained, "I left him on his own finally because we'd started to waste too much time haggling. So after mutual agreements on storyline and character, Mank went off with Houseman and did his version, while I stayed in Hollywood and wrote mine." So rather than writing nose to nose, they agreed broadly on what they were doing and then wrote their own. But Welles was always going to have the final say in the writing. Now, just a little tangent. Herman Mankiewicz had a younger brother called Joseph, who was a writer, director and producer. And he's got a few good films to his name. He wrote and directed All About Eve, Julius Caesar, that's the Brando version, Guys and Dolls, also with Brando and Frank Sinatra, Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor, so going from one diva to another there, I think, and then Sleuth, which we covered in episode 13 and also in the Michael Caine special we did, episode 23, part 2 of that. And I discovered from looking at Sleuth that Laurence Olivier was also a diva, so Joseph knew a little bit about that. Herman Mankiewicz knew Hearst, the good and the bad. He wrote American, which is what it was originally called, as we said, in 6 weeks, then did a second draft, and apparently Welles took over from the third draft, or possibly after the third draft. It doesn't really matter too much. The basic thing is that they were writing separately, but Welles was always going to collate it together. There was a little bit of a dispute. One biographer seemed to think that Welles wrote himself into the Kane character, and maybe Mank wrote the Hearst bits. Robert Wise, who was the editor, I'll talk about him later, when viewing the film on its 50th anniversary, wondered if Orson had written his own autobiography in advance. And I did ask Ghosty about that. Was there much similarity between the older Charles Foster Kane and the older Welles? I don't think their lives particularly paralleled each other, just in a very general way. You know, they may have both become quite isolated and they were both, let's say, difficult characters, but if you give anybody a lot of money and power, wouldn't everyone be a difficult character? Taking Mank's drafts, Welles drastically condensed and rearranged them, then added scenes of his own. The industry accused Welles of underplaying Manx contribution to the script, but Welles countered the attacks by saying, "At the end, naturally, I was the one making the picture, after all, who had to make the decisions. I used what I wanted of Manx and, rightly or wrongly, kept what I liked of my own." The fifth draft, so Wells's third, was accepted by the RKO head. The contract stated that Mankiewicz was to receive no credit for his work as he was hired as a script doctor. Before he signed the contract, he was advised by his agents that all credit for his work belonged to Welles and the Mercury Theatre, the author and creator, inverted commas. As the film neared release, however, Mankiewicz began wanting a writing credit and even threatened to take out full-page advertisements in trade papers and to get his friend Ben Hecht, he's a well-known writer, to write an exposé for the Saturday Evening Post. Mankiewicz also threatened to go to the Screenwriters Guild and claim full credit for writing the entire script by himself. After lodging a protest with the Guild, Mankiewicz withdrew it, then vacillated. The question was resolved in January 1941 when the studio, RKO Pictures, awarded Mankiewicz credit, so he got the co-credit, as we already know. Now, a story I won't go into here is Pauline Kael is a very well-known critic. You may know my thoughts on the idea that Pauline Kael or Roger Ebert could sink a film just by their bad review. The idea that one person should have that so much critical power is ridiculous. And she hated Stanley Kubrick's films as well, which doesn't endear me to her. But there's a book called The Citizen Kane book, and it's basically almost a book-length essay, or half a book in this case, called Raising Kane that Pauline Kael wrote, and then the rest of it is the actual script for Citizen Kane. So you can make your own mind up if you get that book. But her contention is that Welles may have not written any of it or only written some of it. Now, Peter Bogdanovich, who became a famous director in the 70s, Last Picture Show, amongst other films, he became a friend of Welles and he defended him. And a study was done using memos and the shooting script that proved that Welles definitely wrote some of it. From watching the film, as I said a few more times, it's clear that Orson Welles wrote some of it because the Kane bits, the bits which are the similarities in Welles and Kane, I'm sure must have been him. Now, who was the film about? Again, this would be its own podcast. And this Battle Over Citizen Kane documentary was really centering on this, really. Welles never confirmed a principal source for the character of Charles Foster Kane. John Houseman, who said was his partner in the Mercury Theatre, wrote that Kane is a synthesis of different personalities, with Hearst's life used as the main source. Some events and details were invented, and Houseman wrote that he and Mankiewicz also grafted anecdotes from other giants of journalism, including Pulitzer, who was Hearst's great rival, Northcliffe, and Manx's first boss, Herbert Bayard Swope. I don't know those other people. Welles said, quote, "Mr. Hearst was quite a bit like Kane, although Kane isn't really founded on Hearst in particular. Many people sat for it, so to speak." He specifically acknowledged that aspects of Kane were drawn from the lives of two business tycoons familiar from his youth in Chicago, Samuel Insull and Harold Fowler McCormick. Many assume that the character of Susan Alexander Kane was based on Marion Davis, Hearst's mistress, whose career he managed. And we mentioned as well, when we talked about Citizen Kane before, that Rosebud was supposed to be his nickname for her vagina. This assumption was a major reason Hearst tried to destroy Citizen Kane. Welles denied that the character was based on Davis, who he called an extraordinary woman, nothing like the character Dorothy Common-Gore played in the movie. So that's Susan Kane, his second wife. Hearst and Marion lived happily, much unlike Kane and Susan, though she was known as a gold digger and was only 18 when they met, 35 years younger than him. He controlled her career while she had affairs, quote, to give him something to think about. Welles cited Insull's building of the Chicago Opera House and McCormick's lavish promotion of the opera career of his second wife as direct influences on the screenplay. So we're just getting a little bit from everywhere, and that's generally what the best art does. You take some real-life events, you take some of the things that have inspired you, whether it's filmmaking techniques or actual content, and then you create something of your own. Welles credited the name Rosebud to Mankiewicz. Mankiewicz's biographer, Richard Merriman, wrote that the symbol of his own damaged childhood was a treasured bicycle stolen while he visited the public library and not replaced by his family as punishment. So that's where we get the idea of something that Kane played with as a child. I feel like I might not spoil the Rosebud thing now, just in case you haven't watched the film before you're listening to this. But obviously it will come up when we get to the film. Now, looking more at this Hearst and Kane connection, Mankiewicz accidentally, in inverted commas, slipped a copy of the script into the hands of one of his writer friends from the San Simeon scene. So Hearst had this house might be too small a word for it, castle, palace, estate, called San Simeon, and Charles Lederer was part of that set. But he happened to be also Marion Davies' nephew, so that's Hearst's mistress's nephew. And in case that wasn't dicey enough, Lederer, who's this writer friend, would also marry Wells's ex-wife Virginia in May 1940, about 6 weeks before shooting of Citizen Kane started. And guess where they got married? At San Simeon, with Hearst and Davis among the attendees. So there's a direct connection between Wells and Hearst in the form of Charles Lederer. As soon as Hearst had seen the script, it actually got sent back with lots of notes on it. Now, one argument for Kane being Hearst is a line near the start of the film, which is almost a direct lift. It's slightly different from something Hearst said. I'll get to that when we get to the scene. Orson also had a story that he was going to the opening night of Kane and was in an elevator with Hearst. Again, this sort of sounds like a bit of a tall tale. The fact that he's going to the premiere and just happens to be in a lift with Hearst. Wells offered tickets, which Hearst didn't reply to. So he says, I've got some good tickets, and Hearst just blanks him. And Wells said that if that had been Charles Foster Kane, he would have gone. It's a nice story, but I'm not sure I buy it. Now, the negative of the film nearly got burned at the time. We're jumping forward a bit from after the film was made. The film's release was delayed while it hung in the balance. At the meeting, Wells gave a stirring oration and saved the film. Again, it's probably not as simple as that, but it's a good story. The original negative was burned in the early 50s, but a duplicate existed, which is how we can enjoy the film now. Now, I was trying to think regarding Hearst, who you could compare him to now, and the best I could come up with was Rupert Murdoch, who has great sway, or has had great sway. I mean, he still owns. He must be in his 90s now, but he's been a very, very powerful figure, and in England he's probably best known for the rise of the tabloids. So imagine a 24-year-old upstart making a film that mocked Murdoch to some extent, and certainly mocked his mistress. I think Citizen Kane's also a film about the American dream, which really becomes the American nightmare. But when we look at the actual upbringing of the Charles Foster Kane character, you'll see that it's not quite the American dream. There's one quite significant difference.
End of part 1.
This was the real Marion Davies. The collision between Hearst and Orson Welles, the battle over Citizen Kane, was in large part a fight over the honor of this woman. For when the real William Randolph Hearst fell in love, he did it to scale. Mountains would move. Palaces would be built. The nation as a whole was going to love this woman. He saw her in a chorus line in 1915. Hearst was 52, with his wife pregnant at home. But he still haunted the theaters. Second row, one seat for him, one for his hat. He was familiar to the showgirls, one of the wealthy men who'd give a girl something nice if she favored him with her company. Marion was 18, but a practiced hand at this game. When she lost his first gift, a Tiffany watch, she called Hearst up and got another. She was a gold digger and made no bones about it, but she knew how to make Hearst laugh.
She was incredibly, heartbreakingly beautiful. And she had been raised much in the tradition of Colette, where her mother encouraged her to pay a lot of flattering attention to men of incredible means.
Marion was absolutely enchanting. Everybody loved her. She was
cheery, jolly, generous, and full of humor. Glorious gal.
When Hearst finally realized he was never going to be president, there was this consolation. He was now free to live as he chose. He was going to add a new life of impossible scale. He would turn San Simeon into a palace. He would take on the movie business, not to dabble, but to become a movie giant, a mogul. And he would live openly with a showgirl, 35 years his junior. But she wasn't going to stay a showgirl.
The first film that he produced for Marion Davies was his favorite historical romantic epic. And in order to premiere the film, he goes to the theater and completely remodels the theater and even surrounds the entire movie screen with hundreds of thousands of pink roses and fans that are strategically placed to waft the scent of roses across the audience.
For another Davies epic, when knighthood was in flower, Hearst spent 15 times the normal budget, an amount he then publicized in his papers.
It's well known how much he used his papers to feature her. This overwhelming diet of Marion Davies every day in Hearst papers really almost became kind of a joke.
The trouble was that Hearst liked her to be kind of genteel and use her and kind of liked to see her in costume pictures. And that wasn't what she was like. She was actually quite mischievous and had a great sense of humor and really is charming. It's just the stuff that Hearst didn't like to see her do.
In Hollywood, they said she'd be nothing without Hearst. Marion was the sort who'd say so herself. She never complained about his 12-page telegrams, dictating every scene in her films. She had her own way of making her points to Hearst, or Pops, as she called him. She knew he had his private detectives reporting on her when she had affairs with Charlie Chaplin, Leslie Howard, Dick Powell. Well, Marion would say, that should give him something to think about.